Okay, students, we're going to start chapter 17 today, which is Challenges to Corporate and World Power, 1877 to 1890. There was a resistance to legal and military authority, and what we're going to cover in this chapter is what were the various protests, strategies used by different groups of people who faced discrimination and at time of violence from employers, government officials, vigilantes, and the U.S. military. We're going to examine that in this chapter. There was a revolt in the workplace. What technological and structural changes in the workplace prompted farmers and workers to organize between 1877 and 1890. We start to see the rise of what was known as the Populist Farmers Alliance. Concurrents of reform. How did social reformers differ from labor radicals in their assumptions about the need for and the means of social change? We start to see the rise of what they call social justice warriors. The key topics that we're going to be discussing in Chapter 17 are the captains of industry versus the knights of labor from 1877 to 1900, government and industry, a trust unto itself, the workers' strike back. We're going to talk about the Haymarket riot of 1886 in Chicago, and the age of reform. There were Chinese lawsuits in California that were going on at this time, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to sue the federal government because they believed they had a right to be back in this country. They had to be in this country. Blacks in the New South. What was the New South? The New South was the South that rose basically as it did in the antebellum days, except that blacks were a part of the New South, but they were treated unfairly. They were always treated unfairly in the South. And then we start to see Jim Crow in the West against the Indians. And there was a protest movement called the Ghost Dance in the West on the High Plains. They were Indians, of course, and we'll get into that a little bit further. The path to economic centralization and integration was not smooth. There was resistance to European Americans. We had great waves of immigrants coming to the United States during this time, and there was a great resistance to them. It's what's known as nativism, which are people, excuse me, my nose itches. There were people that were, they believed anybody not born in America was not an American, okay? And prejudices were met with resistance. People from then on just didn't take it anymore. They just wanted to be part of the American fabric. All right, the Chinese in California, of course, we talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and then there was violence against the Chinese. Again, basically because Americans believed the Chinese were taking jobs that Americans were going to do, but Americans really didn't want to do them, building the railroads and things. And they also set up shop in small western towns with laundromats and laundry businesses and other things, houses of prostitution, gambling dens, more importantly, opium dens. Opium became readily available in the United States at this time. The Chinese used the courts, U.S. courts, to their advantage in the California Supreme Court in 1862, and Yikwo versus Hopkins, and 1885 Tape versus Hurley, and you can read about those cases a little bit more in depth in your books. This is a photo of a Chinese family that came to the United States. Of course, they were escaping poverty. Who isn't trying to escape poverty in their homelands? And they were big families, but they were very, very close. And the Chinese were very industrial. Most Asian people are very industrial. They tend to save a lot of money rather than spend it. So when they have these large families coming over here, there was a lot of animosity toward them because they didn't spend a lot of money. They generally tended to save it, but they did contribute to the economy. In the New South, they wanted to embrace industrialization. During the Civil War, the North won the war militarily because they had a lot of industrialization. They could build cannons, they could build weapons, rifles very, very quickly, wagons, things of that nature. It promoted reconciliation between blacks and whites in the New South. However, it still did not give blacks the rights that they so richly deserved. Factory and professional work was dominated by whites. A lot of blacks left the South to go north to get industrial jobs, and then they wound up not having any work because they were black. And in the North, the prejudice was almost as bad. Well, what we see is an emergence of what's known as the new black elite. There were limited opportunities. There was discrimination because of Jim Crow, and there was lynching. Lynching is an extra legal device that was used by a lot of, let's say, law enforcement in the South to lynch blacks, to get them to understand the message that whites were trying to put out. And that is, if you go against the black codes or Jim Crow, you were going to wind up dead, okay, or beaten severely. And we see a large amount of lynchings going on during this time. Now, of course, at this time also, you had other immigrants coming into the country, and I'm going to speak primarily about Louisiana because I wrote a book about it. It was called Italian Louisiana, and I'm not begging you to go out and buy it, but this is what I discussed in it, was the lynching of Italians. Because when the Italians came over here, they were welcomed as white. And then later on, they turned into some gray area between white and black. And so Italians were very discriminated against. And the thing was that the reason why the Italians associated with blacks is because they didn't know what that prejudice was at all. They had not, well, they experienced it in their home country because between Northern Italians and Southern Italians, Northern Italians consider Southern Italians they consider them barbarians and backward, things of that nature, excuse me. But they were mostly farm workers. So there was a lot of lynching going on in the United States. I think by the time the toll had been taken amongst all the races that had been, or ethnicities that had been discriminated against, there was something like 4,200 lynchings over the course of almost 100 years. And that's a lot. The Buffalo Soldiers, these were all black soldiers that belonged to the 9th and 10th Cavalry divisions in the West. They were all black soldiers, but they were led by white officers, and their tasks varied. Sometimes they would go into the West, and the thing is that they black soldiers understood the discrimination against themselves, and then they understood the discrimination against the Indians, but the prejudice continued against blacks and Indians. So now, white Northern Europeans needed somebody else to hate, so they started hating the Indians as well as the blacks. The blacks settled in the West. These were known as exodusters. These were people that had probably gained their freedom in the South and decided to move west because they thought they could get away from Jim Crow and the discrimination, but it was waiting for them when they got there. The Indian goals were to maintain independence from whites. In 1889, Wovoka preached the ghost dance. Now, the ghost dance had to do with Indian freedom. Indians were returned to a previous age. And because the Indians did something new to protest against the white suppression, military and settlers grew very anxious. And there was a massacre at Wounded Knee Creek in 1890 in South Dakota, where the Army mowed down an entire tribe of men, women, and children with the Gatling gun because they refused to move to the reservations. Anything that whites disagree with, predominantly in the United States at that time, especially against the Indians, was met with military force. William Philip Sheridan once said, he was a former general in the Union Army, became a general out west. He said, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. So that basically spells out the attitude toward the Indians. Now, in this map, we see resistance to legal and military authority. It was actually stretching a long way into the West. You can see that. This is mostly, when we look at the spread of protest against the United States government in the West. And you see, the Indians were a little bit more than, they were not very, how can I say, agreeable with what the American government wanted to do with them, because they considered the land that they lived on, it belonged to everyone else. It didn't belong to any one person. It belonged to everybody. Why were Native Americans drawn to the teachings of Wovoka, and discuss the reaction of the U.S. cavalry to the ghost dance religion? Well, I already told you that about the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek. Now, this would be the first massacre at Wounded Knee. There would later be an incident in the 1970s involving Wounded Knee, where they actually brought back the ghost dance because of what the American government was doing to the Native American people. Revolt in the workplace. There were troubles on farms, and the militancy in the factories and mines, and then the Haymarket bombing. There was militancy in factories and mines because people were protesting working conditions. Back then, you did not have any child labor laws, so child labor was it was kind of, how should I say it? It was very cold. You know, sometimes children were the only people that could get into these machines, some of these machines in the factories, and fix them. Well, somebody hits a power button and a child is crushed. There was no compensation for their family. It's not safe to work in mines as well. When you work in mines, it can be a cave-in. You could be stuck in there for days, your oxygen runs out, and you die. So there was a lot of militancy in that. And it was also a movement to form unions. And the Haymarket bombing was actually an anarchist worker terrorist act that took place in Chicago. Populists form in response to industrial capitalism. Populists are more for the people. They want better conditions. An effort to bring unity to various working groups. That's where unions start to come in. There are challenges to unity, and success included prejudices and consumer culture. So when we look at the forming of the unions and we look at the labor problems that occurred, we start to see a movement toward safety. Okay, and when you have safety as a primary consideration, sometimes you have to sometimes companies have to pay more money to make that workplace safe, but they protect the workers, and that's what the owners would not do. They wouldn't make it safe. Discuss the founding Farmers Alliance movement. How is the Farmers Alliance similar to and different than the Populist Party? Well, the Farmers Alliance movement was a movement that organized because individual farmers could not make money on their own. So they formed what was called a cooperative, which means that they put all their goods into one basket and then they sold them, and then they split the money among the members of the alliance. Now, why is that unfair? That's unfair because a lot of people, especially if you've done group assignments, especially if you've been in high school, you do group assignments. One person does more work than the other one. All right. So the Farmers Alliance was a reaction to the rise in costs of shipping goods, the lessening of costs being paid for the goods that you produced. This is a photo of a windmill in the Midwest. Now, later on in the Midwest, farmers were going to suffer a great deal because of what was known as a climatic anomaly called the Dust Bowl. Okay, it was a big dust storm that came along and made the land inarable. You could not do anything with it. Hardships to laborers, the layoffs and wage cuts, and no laws regulated private industry. So what you could do is, if you had workers that died on the job, you just take them out, put more workers in. You don't have to pay any compensation. Workers began to organize for safer conditions and lesser work days. I mean, you're working 12 to 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's a lot, and you're not getting paid a lot for that either. I mean, you may be making $1.50, $2 a week with that job. Organizing workers. Leonora Barry, organizer for the Knights of Labor. There was no right to organize until 1935, so they couldn't really organize because the government didn't want unions organizing, and neither did private industry. The Knights of Labor were organized, and those were supposed to be idealists that fought for better working conditions. And there were popular writers at that time that talked about the unsafe conditions and unfair conditions that people actually had to endure if they wanted to work and support your family. How did factors such as urbanization and wage levels affect labor activity? Well, that's fairly easy. The more people that move to the city, okay, and you build a city up from that, you're going to have problems which only urbanization can develop. And those problems are disease, crime, and basically just a downright poverty. It's just it invades the situation, because what happens when you lose your job? If you lose your job and can't find another job, you either move or you stay where you are and you make the best of a bad situation. So we start to see rises in crime because of urbanization, and the spread of diseases, because people are so packed together in these urban areas. How did the spread of the Knights of Labor assemblies relate to the geographic distribution of different U.S. industries? Well, the bigger the industries, the larger the meetings were going to become. And what was labor unrest? Where was labor unrest most pronounced? It's most pronounced in urban areas, specifically if you go look at Chicago or New York. Now, this is a photo, an illustration of what occurred as a result. This is basically, this magazine illustration shows the 7 policemen killed in the Chicago Haymarket Square clash on May 4th, 1886. A crowd had gathered in the square to agitate for the 8-hour workday and to support striking workers at the McCormick harvesting machine plant. The person who threw a bomb into the crowd was never identified, although 8 anarchists were convicted of the crime, and 4 of them, including a guy named Albert Parsons, were hanged. You see, when you have people who are anarchists, they want to overthrow the government no matter what it takes. And they figure they could use violence in order to cause unrest and generally kind of cause a snowball to roll downhill and get larger and larger. But this didn't work. But we're going to see more of this as labor movements move along. Okay, what was the significance of Parsons's claim that the triumph of socialism is inevitable and natural? Well, okay, socialism. Here's the problem with socialism. Socialism depends on other people's money. Like if you pay taxes, okay, your tax dollars are going to something that you have no idea what it's going to. And if you continue to tax and spend, like our government has become used to, within the last few years, then you're going to have a problem, because you're going to run out of other people's money. What was Parsons' anarchist critique of capitalism? It didn't work. It was his idea was it didn't work. It went on the backs of working people, and you can't do that because those are the people that pay the most taxes. Okay. Bring Parsons and Andrew Carnegie into conversation with each other about the inevitable future of the United States. Andrew Carnegie was a capitalist. Parsons was a socialist. And the socialists believe that the rich people should pay for the poor people. Well, I think Carnegie's going to disagree with that very much. Why did many Americans identify anarchists with violence? Well, anarchists are violent people most of the time. If you look at most of the revolutions that occurred throughout world history, anarchists want to throw over the government. The only way they overthrow the government is they kill people. And they are violent. They're very violent. This is Albert Parsons, the gentleman that was hanged. He was the socialist. He believed that ordinary people had aspirations of liberty that would inevitably produce a system whereby workers owned the means of production. To quarrel with this prediction, he thought, is silly and vain. Well, I'm going to argue with it, because number one, you can't give the means of production to workers, because a lot of the workers are untrained. They're very uninformed. They're very uneducated. And you're going to give them all this industry to produce? It's not going to happen. The May Day strike was part of the 8-hour workday movement. The protests the murder of strikers. See, when people would go on strike, they'd call out the police, or they have strike breakers, which are people who are predominantly just violent. And they go there and they break up the strike no matter how bad it is. And sometimes they use violent means by killing strikers in order to send a message. 2 McCormick Reaper strikers had been killed on the previous day, and then a bomb exploded in Haymarket, which we just talked about it. Haymarket demoralized the labor movement. The Knights of Labor faded, and the American Federation of Labor emerged. Now, why is that? Because of the simple fact that if anarchism is associated with the labor movement, the government doesn't want anybody joining a labor movement. It's trouble. They're not interested in justice. The government wants peace. Remember that. Although the National Labor Union and the Knights of Labor did not survive the decades of the 1870s and 1880s, workers laid the foundation of the American labor movement, and they did. Later on, we'd see, now, labor unions are a good idea at first. They were a good idea at first, but then, like any good idea, you start to see corruption involved with these ideas. Discuss the challenges facing labor in the 1880s and 1890s and describe the attempts at unionization. Why was the American Federation of Labor a more successful union than its predecessors? Why? Because it had the government had a hand in it. The other ones were just run by people that wanted to agitate. You know, you got to understand, there's people throughout the world that just want to agitate. They don't want to do things properly. They want to do them quickly and radically. So it was a slow, methodical type of organization rather than, yeah, let's bomb something and start an organization. Crosscurrents of Reform, the goal of Indian assimilation, transatlantic networks of reform, and women reformers beginning to burst the bonds. At this time, we talk about the 1880s and the 1890s, women wanted the right to vote. And why shouldn't they? They were the ones who are basically the womb of civilization. Without women, there wouldn't be any births. There wouldn't be any growth in populations. Let's see. Jacob Riis chronicled how the other half lives in 1890. And what he did was, Jacob Riis was a photographer, and he did this book, this photographic book, where he used photographs of poor families in the slums of New York to illustrate the poor. Back then, there wasn't welfare, there wasn't food stamps, there wasn't WIC, there wasn't the Department of Child Services. They didn't have that. So a lot of times when the main breadwinner was out of work, there's nothing they could do. They were just poor. He published photographs with explanations, and reformist causes included. Reformers wanted to reform this. They wanted to help the poor. So private charitable organizations were organized. Reformist causes included helping poor, empowering women, and improving immigrant conditions. Some were interested in moral behavior. Well, let's look at the Irish for one. The stereotype of the Irish were the husband gets drunk, the mother gets pregnant, they have more babies. It happens over and over and over again. This was a stereotype, okay? And nativists thrived on this stereotype. Helping the poor, empowering women, improving immigrant conditions. A lot of times when immigrants came over here, they had not a penny to their name, and they had to look for work. And they were actually contributing to the poor in the United States. This is a photograph of a couple of kids, little kids. If you look, they don't have any shoes on. It's probably winter, and they're sleeping in an alleyway. This is the incredible definition of poor. Okay, these were Jacob Riis titled this photograph "Street Arabs in Sleeping Quarters." Okay, how the other half lived exposed the poverty and wretched living conditions endured by many immigrants in New York, the Lower East Side. In certain cases, Riis carefully positioned his subjects before photographing them. It is doubtful that these little boys were sleeping while the photographer noisily set up his equipment a few feet away. Now, when you look at camera equipment back then, it took a lot to set it up. It's not just a camera you pull out of your pocket. These things had these enormous tripods, and it was a big box about this big, and you had to expose the film just right to get the photograph. Now cameras do it automatically. So it was noisy, and so if Riis set this up, he had to pose them. That's not to say that they didn't exist. Harshness of reservations brought calls for reform for Indians. Reservations were often unsuitable. Now, what does that mean by unsuitable? Well, they often had a high instance of alcoholism, high instances of crime, and it was because the Indians were used to being free, and now they're put into this specific area. Assimilation was promoted by whites and some Indians so that Indians could assimilate into the American fabric. Now here's the problem. You've got a culture that's thousands of years old that's trying to assimilate into a culture that's only like 150 years old. So that could be a problem. There were goals. There were Indian boarding schools movement, okay? And you can read about the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 in your books. It had to do with Indian assimilation. This is a Susan LaFlesche was the first Indian woman to become a physician in the United States. Together with her sisters Marguerite and Lucy, Susan attended Hampton Institute in Virginia, a vocational school for African Americans and Indians. This photo, taken around 1885, shows Hampton students performing in a pageant at the school. Susan in the center and the woman on the right represented Indians of the past. The other students represented Indians of the present. Hampton's mission was to prepare its students for farming and trade skills. And this woman went on to get a medical degree. That should say, that should say something. Explain the meaning of the Carlisle School motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." How successful were the numerous Indian schools in achieving their goals? Well, I think that's a little bit strong. Kill the Indian and save the man. What they wanted to do was kill the culture that was within each Indian, all right? And the Indian schools that were set up achieved their goals temporarily. But like any good thing, they weren't funded properly. So one of the really surprising Indians that came out of the Carlisle School was an athlete by the name of Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe was named the greatest athlete of the last 50 years, I believe in 1950. He went to the Olympics and won gold medals, and then he came home and he played semi-professional baseball. Actually played semi-professional football and semi-professional baseball. At one time his medals were taken away from him, but then they were restored, because you see, when you go to the Olympics back then, you had to be an amateur. You could not be a professional athlete. Improved sea transportation led to an exchange of ideas, the social gospel, where social Darwinism was taken out of the equation, and equality for everyone was supposed to be very popular in the United States, although we still had Jim Crow, we still had discrimination against the Indians. And Jane Addams wrote about these extensively. I'm sure you can find out about her in your book. You can read about her in your textbook. Reform work. There were strong missionary traits. The Occidental branch of the Women's Foreign Missionary Society, Industrial Christian Home, the Colorado Cottage Home, Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was against drinking. They wanted to outlaw drinking because they felt that alcohol was the demon that was destroying families back then. Women's suffrage gained the vote in the West. Why? Because the West was expanding. Remember, we go back to the railroad days. The West was expanding, and women wanted to gain the vote in the West. Now, here is a woman by the name of Frances Willard. She grew up on a farm in Wisconsin Territory. She served as the first dean of women at Northwestern University in Illinois. In the mid-1870s, she decided to devote her life to the cause of temperance. Again, drink. Get rid of it. From 1879 until her death, she was president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Willard developed what she called a do-everything policy. Under her leadership, the WCTU addressed a range of issues, including women's suffrage and workers' rights. The women's movement was very strong back then. Again, for the reasons that I stated, women wanted equality. Women would not gain the right to vote until after World War I, because American society had changed because of World War I. A lot of women had to take the jobs that men had vacated so that they could go fight in uniform in Europe, and we'll talk about that at a later time. The decades of the 1870s and 1880s were a period of transition and unrest. While U.S. and transatlantic reform movements were organized in the 1880s, Native Americans suffered on the Great Plains. Laborers went on strike in American cities, and frustrated hired farmhands broke machines in the Midwest. So this is what we look at in the United States in the 1870s and 1880s. There would be a slew of presidential candidates who would come up and say, well, I'm going to end this. And it never really happened. the discrimination against blacks and Indians and even women would continue into the 20th century. Describe several women reformers of this era and explain why they did not all agree on the issue of suffrage for women. Well, there was Susan B. Anthony was one of them. She wanted suffrage across the board. And then there was, it'll come to me, Margaret Sanger, who determined that women should be free to express their sexuality. All women except. Okay, so we are at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. What I would like you to do is continue reading chapter 17. If you want to do some background research on the temperance movement or the Ku Klux Klan and lynchings, I suggest you go to YouTube and do that. I have a video. I think I have a video up there about it. No, I don't have a video about a lynching. I think I'm gonna do one because my YouTube channel is getting more subscribers and they really feel that the work is decent. I think I have some work to go as far as editing videos. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you with this now, and I'll see you next time when we talk about chapter 18.